On a winter evening in 1985, Rachel Hargreaves stepped out of her small flat in the council estate of Harper Hay, Manchester, beneath the jaundiced glow of streetlights and a cold that cut to the bone. A few hours later, she did not return. No coat, no handbag, no money, no note, as though she had only meant to step out and come straight back. No accident, no scene, no body. The police logged a missing person case, and witnesses placed Rachel in different locations at the same stretch of time. The file grew thick, then was consigned to the cold case drawer, and people said perhaps she had simply chosen to vanish, that young women sometimes disappear like that. But many years later, a small overlooked detail was reopened, dragging with it an unexplainable gap in time, a location never searched, and a memory that sounded too accurate to be true, forcing everyone to return to the night Rachel did not come home. Before we dive deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you never miss the latest cases. Manchester, winter 1985, the council estate in Harper Hay lay submerged in the damp, biting cold, typical of the north of England, where rows of low, gray blocks stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the pale yellow sodium streetlights that cast a weary glow onto the rain-slicked concrete, a light never designed to warm anyone. That evening unfolded no differently from hundreds of others. Inside the Hargreaves family's small flat, supper was served hastily. A few plates still held half-eaten food on the table, the smell of boiled potatoes and thin gravy mingling with the chill seeping through the window frames. Rachel Hargreaves, 19 years old, pulled on a thin jumper, tied her hair back neatly, and said simply that she was popping out for a bit and would be right back. No arguments, no tension, no words carrying any foreboding. She stepped out of the flat with the familiar gait of a young woman from the estate who had walked that corridor hundreds of times, who knew every stair, every flickering bulb. The door closed behind Rachel, leaving the room inside a fraction quieter, where her coat still hung on the back of the door, where her handbag sat neatly on the chair, as though she had only gone somewhere very close, very quickly, as though everything was waiting for her to return and resume ordinary life. Outside, Harper Hay was swallowed by the wind whistling between the blocks, the occasional car passing on the main road, streetlights stretching into long yellow streaks across the wet tarmac. No one watched Rachel for long, because here a young woman leaving home in the evening was nothing remarkable. Time passed slowly in the way only winter nights can manage, when the hands of the clock seem heavier, when minutes slip by without leaving a mark. By midnight, the Hargreaves flat was still lit, waiting taking shape, vague at first, merely a hazy feeling that Rachel ought to have been back by now. The telephone was lifted, then set down again. Perhaps she had called at a friend's, perhaps she missed the last bus, perhaps she had simply stayed out longer than planned. But as the night slid toward morning, as the first vehicles of the new day sounded in the distance, the silence became something else entirely, heavier, harder to explain away. The next morning, the family began searching in the way of people not yet ready to name their fear. They rang round acquaintances, stood at the end of the corridor, looking down into the courtyard, walked the estate, checked the streets Rachel usually took, hoping to spot her familiar figure, appearing round a corner, as she had so many times before. But Harper Hay was still just Harper Hay on a winter morning, gray, cold, and indifferent. With each passing hour, waiting turned into unmistakable worry. There was no longer room for gentle assumptions. Finally, when there was nowhere left to look, when every call met only silence, the Hargreaves family put on their coats, left the familiar estate, and walked to the local station of Greater Manchester Police. In the duty room, cold white lights shone down onto the worn wooden counter, questions were asked, details repeated, and when the officer wrote the name Rachel Hargreaves into the log, that moment marked an invisible boundary between gone out and not back yet, and missing. The duty room door closed behind them with a dry snap that echoed along the corridor, like a full stop to an evening that had seemed perfectly ordinary, and the starting point of a silence no one in that room could have foreseen. When the duty room door closed behind the Hargreaves family, Rachel's missing person file was formally accepted by Greater Manchester Police, and from that instant, the case was placed on desks, not as an unfinished life story, but as a puzzle to be solved with logic, evidence, and priorities. The investigation began with the basic but obligatory questions that appear in every missing person file, yet rarely receive immediate answers. Where was Rachel last seen? Which direction did she take afterwards? And who was the last person to have confirmed contact with her? The detectives knew that in the first 24 hours information is usually still fragmented. Witness memories have not yet been contaminated by rumor, and small discrepancies, if recorded promptly, can later become pivotal. Last seen was placed at the top of the list. Police began working backwards through the previous evening, tracing Rachel's familiar route from her council flat in Harper Hay, identifying the places she might routinely have passed, close enough not to arouse suspicion, yet far enough to complicate a search. Running parallel was last known direction, the question of where she headed after her final confirmed sighting, because in many disappearances, it is the direction rather than the destination that is most often misunderstood. Detectives ordered checks on bus routes operating that evening, examined the common footpaths linking Harper Hay with Cheatham Hill and neighboring areas, and drew up a preliminary map, not to reach conclusions, but to rule things out. Last known contact formed the third pillar of the framework. Anyone who had spoken to Rachel in those final hours, even a casual remark, a nod or a brief roadside chat, carried equal weight at this stage, because every detail was assumed to lack hierarchy until proven otherwise. In the first 24 hours, GMP focused on gathering background information systematically: Rachel's domestic circumstances, daily habits, work schedule, close relationships, the routes she usually took, and the places she seldom visited. This was not about constructing a psychological profile, but about establishing a baseline so that any subsequent deviation would stand out clearly. The officers on the first shift knew that a missing person case only truly begins when one knows what was normal for the victim, because only then does the abnormal reveal itself. It was during this background gathering that a small detail began to attract notice, though at first it was not treated as evidence, barely even a suspicion. When the flat Rachel had left the previous evening was examined, police noted that many important personal items remained exactly where they belonged. The thick coat suitable for a Manchester winter had not been taken, the handbag was still inside, personal documents and cash showed no sign of hasty collection. In cases of voluntary disappearance, especially among the young, there is usually a common pattern: people prepare at least the essentials for the first few days, or conversely leave a clear sign of severance. Here, there was no such sign. Rachel had left the flat as though she intended to be gone only minutes, without the items anyone living in Manchester in the winter of 1985 would know were essential if they did not plan to return soon. This created a very slight behavioral deviation, small enough to be overlooked, yet clear enough for experienced detectives to note carefully. They did not conclude Rachel had not disappeared voluntarily, but neither could they slot her behavior into the category of prepared departure. In the initial investigative framework, the detail was flagged as something to revisit once more data arrived, a piece of the jigsaw not yet in place. At the same time, detectives continued strengthening the three established pillars, because they understood that without locking down last seen, last known direction, and last known contact, every later hypothesis would remain mere speculation. The case, though only on its second day, already had the shape of a proper investigation, where each subsequent decision would either shorten the path to the truth or unwittingly push it further away, and where a seemingly harmless detail about what Rachel had left behind began quietly asking a question no one yet dared voice aloud: whether she had truly left of her own accord. The investigation moved into its next phase with a very clear focus. The last scene had to be pinned down, because until they knew for certain where and when Rachel Hargreaves was last sighted, every attempt to reconstruct the night of her disappearance remained guesswork. Greater Manchester police detectives concentrated on the Cheatham Hill, Bury New Road area, where multiple independent witness statements placed Rachel that evening. It was a familiar, busy thoroughfare, even on a winter night, lined with small shops, fast food outlets, and bus stops linking Harpurhey to surrounding districts. Interviews were conducted strictly by the book, each witness questioned separately, unaware of what others had said, to minimize the risk of memory being led. At first, the picture seemed fairly clear. The first witness, an employee at a shop on Barry New Road, was certain they had seen Rachel at the counter early in the evening. The description was accurate: hair, clothing, and the witness was confident because they had met her a few times before. Yet when pressed for precise timing, the answer remained approximate, based on work rhythm rather than a clock. Another witness, living near Cheetham Hill Road, said they had seen Rachel walking along the pavement not far from that shop, but placed the sighting considerably later. This person remembered clearly because they had just locked up their house, something they only did at a fixed time. Both statements seemed reasonable in isolation, but when placed side by side, they began creating small cracks in the timeline the detectives were trying to build. The problem was not simply that witnesses gave different times, common enough when relying on memory, but that the differences could not easily be reconciled into a single logical sequence. If Rachel was at Barry New Road when the first witness claimed, reaching the spot described by the second witness would have required her to move faster than normal, especially in evening traffic conditions. The detectives widened the witness pool, approaching people working late at bus stops and shops, and residents along the route. Each one had seen Rachel, yet each confirmation carried a slightly different time and location. One placed her near a bus stop north on Barry New Road, another insisted she was waiting for a bus further south, and a third recalled her walking, showing no sign of waiting for transport. What stood out was that no one appeared to be lying outright. Descriptions of appearance and demeanor were consistent, but they could not agree on where she was at any one moment. The detectives built comparison tables, logging each statement with its claimed time, then cross-checked against objective data such as bus timetables and shop closing hours. It was here that the core contradiction emerged. According to the two most credible accounts, Rachel had been seen in two separate locations within the same narrow time window, something impossible if only one Rachel was moving in the ordinary way. The distance between the 2 points was not great geographically, but sufficient to rule out her being in both places simultaneously within the time frame the witnesses firmly asserted. The detectives knew that human memory, under pressure of time and habit, is prone to error, but here the errors were not random. They clustered around one specific window of the evening, as though at some point the entire narrative began sliding off its logical track. A working hypothesis quickly formed within the team: either one witness had made a serious timing error, or some intervening factor had placed Rachel somewhere off her expected path. But on closer scrutiny, the mistake was not as easily explained as usual. One witness anchored their memory to finishing a shift, another to a regular television program, and neither had any obvious reason to adjust their recollection in the same direction. This made the contradiction more dangerous, because it was not merely individual memory lapse, but a sign that the timeline was being built on unstable foundations. From an investigative standpoint, this was the moment the case began to change character. If last seen could not be established with certainty, every deduction about direction and contact would be dragged into the same gray area. The detectives were forced to accept an uncomfortable possibility: at least one of the statements they were relying on was inaccurate, even though the person giving it had no intent to deceive. Worse, that possibility opened a far more troubling question. If Rachel had apparently been placed in two different locations at the same time, there might have existed a stretch of time when she was in neither place anyone remembered, a gap no one saw, no one recorded, and no one knew what had happened within it. When the first round of interviews at Cheetham Hill and Barry New Road concluded, the detectives did not have the clear answer they had hoped for. Instead, they carried away an interim conclusion heavy with unease. Rachel's last seen was not a fixed point, but a cluster of overlapping contradictory memories, and within those contradictions, the case began to reveal a difficult truth: that the night Rachel disappeared had not unfolded in a simple sequence, and that something in those final hours had been obscured from the very first moment. The contradictions emerging from the witness statements at Cheetham Hill and Barry New Road forced the Greater Manchester Police investigation team to do what could no longer be postponed: construct an official timeline, even knowing it would be fragile and might have to be dismantled. On the desk, each statement was placed alongside the others, not according to subjective reliability, but in the chronological order provided by the witnesses. The detectives began with the most certain markers: the time Rachel left her flat in Harper Hay, confirmed by her family; the hours when shops on Bury New Road were still open, and the official timetables of the bus routes running along that thoroughfare on a winter evening in 1985. From there, they attempted to fill the gaps with witness statements, placing Rachel at each purported final sighting. At first, the timeline appeared reasonable. When viewed from a distance, Rachel left home, moved towards Cheetham Hill, appeared on Bury New Road, and then was seen no more. But when those markers were narrowed to 15-minute intervals, the structure began to collapse. One statement claimed Rachel was standing near a shop on Bury New Road at a time when, according to bus timetables, she ought to have been near a different stop if continuing in that direction. Another placed her on Cheetham Hill Road after the shops there had begun closing, which could only happen if Rachel had reversed her familiar route. The detectives cross-referenced every detail with objective data: the time of the last bus passing each point, the average walking time between locations, and the moments when shops pulled down their shutters. The numbers carried no emotion, but they had one advantage human memory lacked: they did not change over time. It was when those numbers were set against the statements that a gap began to appear more clearly. Not a few minutes attributable to error, but a stretch of time too long to ignore. In the preliminary timeline, there was a segment where Rachel could not reasonably be placed anywhere if all the statements were correct. That gap could not be explained by waiting for a bus, as the timetables allowed no such window, nor by walking slowly, as the distances were not great enough. The detectives tried adjusting the timeline in various ways, shifting markers earlier or later within the limits the witnesses deemed certain, but each adjustment only created another contradiction. When one statement was made to align with bus data, it directly conflicted with a shop's closing time. When a marker was shifted to fit walking distances, it caused Rachel to appear in two different places within the same interval, the very issue that had unsettled the team from the start. By this point, the timeline was no longer a tool for clarification, but a harsh test of each statement's accuracy. And the result of that test was clear: the timeline could only exist if at least one of the statements considered reliable was wrong. This was not a conclusion the detectives wished to reach early, as it meant having to doubt a witness without clear evidence of deliberate falsehood. But logic left no alternative. If all statements were correct, Rachel would have had to move in ways that exceeded physical limits within the given time frame, or appear in places objective data showed were impossible. This forced the team to entertain an uncomfortable assumption that one piece of the picture had been misplaced, and continuing to build hypotheses on the current timeline would only lead them further from the truth. That unexplainable time gap became the new focus of the investigation, not because it revealed what had happened, but because it highlighted what had not been seen. The detectives noted clearly in the file that the current timeline was provisional and would have to be dismantled if new data emerged. Yet even in its incomplete state, that timeline achieved something important. It compelled them to acknowledge that the night Rachel disappeared had not unfolded in a simple sequence of events, and that the truth did not lie neatly within any single statement. From this point, the investigation entered a different phase, where every word, every timestamp would no longer be accepted simply because it sounded plausible, but would have to withstand the pressure of one question that grew increasingly haunting as the gap refused to vanish. If the timeline was only valid when one statement was wrong, then who had remembered incorrectly? And why did that very error conceal what had happened to Rachel during the stretch of time no one saw her? With the contradictions in the timeline still unresolved, the investigation team was forced to shift approach, setting aside the question of exactly where Rachel was at any given minute to focus on something seemingly more concrete: how she had traveled and along which routes. The review of the final route did not begin with hypotheses, but with habit. Greater Manchester police detectives spread maps of the Harper Hay, Cheetham Hill, and Bury New Road areas across the table, marking the footpaths Rachel routinely used in her daily life. These were not random paths, but the familiar routes of a young woman living on a council estate, well-lit pavements, shortcuts through residential areas known to locals but rarely noticed by outsiders, and roads Rachel had walked hundreds of times before. The aim of this phase was not to prove she had followed those routes, but to determine whether she had deviated from her usual orbit. The paper review quickly revealed one thing: if Rachel had left home intending only a brief outing, she would almost certainly have chosen these paths. They were short, familiar, and required no passage through isolated or unfamiliar areas. However, when those routes were set against the witness statements and the gap in the timeline, they did not match the emerging picture. To test whether the issue lay in human memory or in the assumption about the route itself, police decided to deploy sniffer dogs, using scent from Rachel's personal items left in the flat. This was a standard step but a decisive one, as it allowed the investigation to move beyond accounts and follow physical traces, less influenced by conjecture. The sniffer dogs were brought to the point where Rachel left the estate and began tracking the scent naturally. In the initial sections, the results were unsurprising. The scent trail followed logical paths, closely adhering to the routes Rachel typically took when walking in the evening. The detectives observed and recorded, believing at least the early part of the journey had been correctly established. But as the trail approached the area of the River Irk, the behavior changed. The dogs slowed, stopped at a location not far from the riverbank, and then failed to continue in any clear direction. To rule out scent interference or error, police had the dog return and approach the area from multiple points. The results remained the same. The trail ended near the River Irk and could not be extended. The initial reaction was to consider the possibility of an accident. In any disappearance involving waterways, the hypothesis of slipping or falling in is raised early. The area around the River Irk was thoroughly searched, from the banks to accessible points from the road. However, the more they searched, the less tenable this hypothesis became. There were no physical signs anyone had slipped into the water, no personal items left near the bank, and the flow in that stretch of river did not suggest it could carry away a person without leaving any trace in such a short time. More importantly, the location where the scent stopped was not a point Rachel would have had reason to approach if following her usual route. It was this mismatch that made the detectives pause and re-examine the entire assumption about the final route. When the point of lost scent was compared to the map of Rachel's habitual movements, one thing became clear: the area near the River Irk lay outside her normal daily orbit. To reach it, Rachel would have had to turn off her familiar paths and head in a direction offering no obvious benefit, especially on a winter evening. This did not fit the idea that she was simply walking habitually, nor that she was en route to a familiar destination. This deviation suggested the possibility that Rachel had not chosen that path herself, or that some factor had caused her to change route abruptly. Extending the search to minor paths around the River Irk area did not clarify matters. Less traveled ways were checked, but yielded no further traces. Rather than reinforcing a hypothesis, each expansion highlighted a question that grew harder to answer. If Rachel had no reason to pass through this area, what had brought her there? The scent trail, which should have narrowed the investigation, now posed a new contradiction, independent of those in the statements and timeline. It pointed to a specific endpoint, but that endpoint did not align with any logical route based on Rachel's habits. When the sniffer dog search concluded, the team had to accept they were no closer to pinpointing exactly where Rachel had gone after the scent was lost. Yet they also drew one important conclusion: the path the trail indicated was not Rachel's familiar one, and the disappearance of the scent in such an unfamiliar location could not be explained simply by chance. The review of the final route, instead of reinforcing what was known, had exposed a clear deviation between the victim's habits and the reality of the physical trace. From this point, the investigation no longer revolved solely around where Rachel had gone, but began to center on a more troubling question: why she had appeared in a place she should never have passed through, and whether the gap in the timeline was connected to that very deviation. After the review of the final route yielded no clear answers, the investigation team returned to the council flat in Harpurhey, not to find new traces, but to re-examine what had been overlooked in the initial search. This was a familiar step in disappearances when the runaway hypothesis still lingered, as voluntary departure rarely occurs without leaving a discernible pattern. The detectives began by re-inventorying all of Rachel Hargreaves' personal belongings, focusing not on what was missing, but on what remained. The list quickly painted a picture ill-suited to the idea that she had left intending not to return. The thick coat essential for Manchester winter weather still hung behind the door. Rachel's everyday handbag, which she seldom left home without, remained on the chair. Personal documents, a small amount of cash, and basic toiletries showed no signs of hasty gathering. No drawers had been ransacked, no wardrobe suggested preparation for a trip longer than a few hours. From a professional standpoint, these details carried weight. In voluntary disappearances, especially among the young, behavior usually leaves clear signs, either minimal but deliberate preparation, taking essentials for the first few days, or a symbolic severance, leaving belongings as an unspoken message. Here there were no signs of either pattern. Rachel appeared to have left the flat as though she would return that same evening, or at the very least very soon. This forced the detectives to reassess the plausibility of the runaway hypothesis, though it could not yet be entirely ruled out at this stage. Behavioral analysis did not stop at the inventory. The detectives cross-referenced Rachel's routines in the weeks before her disappearance, looking for any changes that might suggest intent to abandon her current life. There was no evidence of unusual withdrawals, no letters or notes indicating psychological preparation for vanishing, and no signs she was trying to sever contact with her family. These facts were not enough to prove coercion, but they created a clear distance between what Rachel had done and what is typically seen in voluntary disappearances. Within the team, the runaway hypothesis began to be regarded as a weak possibility, existing mainly for lack of alternatives, rather than because it fitted the victim's behavior. It was during this re-examination of the initial inventory records that a small detail emerged, almost buried in the notes. It was a very ordinary personal item of no material value, hastily listed among the belongings Rachel had not taken. In the report it was mentioned in a single short line, without detailed description, without assessment of importance, and without follow-up in later investigative steps. At the time, no one on the team considered it noteworthy. The item was neither identification, money, nor something usually directly linked to leaving or being forced away. It was recorded as part of the background and quickly pushed to the bottom of priorities. Yet when this detail was set against what had been established from behavioral analysis, its presence in the flat became harder to explain. If Rachel had left intending to return soon, leaving the item behind made sense. But if she had left never planning to return, or even just to stay out overnight, not taking it would be unusual, as it was tied to her daily routine. This contradiction was not large enough to shift the investigation on its own, but it added another small deviation to a picture already unbalanced between behavior and the runaway hypothesis. The detectives realized the item had been recorded too cursorily, not because it was worthless, but because at the time they had no reason to question it. This reflected a familiar reality in investigations. Details that seem unimportant are often set aside when they do not fit the dominant hypothesis. While the runaway theory was still the main line, all data were interpreted to support it, and inconsistencies were treated as exceptions. But by now, as Rachel's behavior increasingly showed no signs of voluntary departure, those exceptions began to stand out more clearly. That small item, though still not fully understood, became a reminder that important pieces might have been overlooked from the start, not because they were hidden, but because no one thought them worth examining closely. At the end of this review phase, the team reached no firm conclusion, but they achieved a tacit consensus. The runaway hypothesis was no longer a solid foundation for the entire investigation. What Rachel had left behind, from coat and handbag to that cursorily noted small item, all indicated she had departed in a temporary state, unprepared, without the essentials for an intentional disappearance. This did not answer where Rachel had gone, but it significantly narrowed what she might have done, and more importantly, it imposed a new requirement on the investigation to return to details once deemed unimportant. because within that initial oversight might lie the key to why Rachel left her Harper Hay flat that evening and never came home. In the context of the hypothesis that Rachel Hargreaves had voluntarily run away, becoming increasingly unconvincing, the investigation team was forced to narrow the question to a more crucial point: who was the last person who could confirm having been with her? This was a natural yet highly risky shift in a missing person investigation, for it moved the focus away from space and behavior, and onto a specific individual, with their memory, motives and immeasurable gray areas. From reviewing Rachel's social relationships and contacts on the day she disappeared, one name began to stand out more clearly than the others: Mark Ellison, 28 years old, living not far from the Cheatham Hill area, and acquainted with Rachel closely enough that meeting her that evening would not be considered unusual. Mark was invited to the police station for a discussion, not as a suspect but as a key witness. His preliminary record revealed nothing alarming: no previous convictions, no criminal history, steady employment, and described by those around him as rather reserved. From the outset, Mark was cooperative, answering questions calmly and without evasion. He confirmed that he had met Rachel on the evening she disappeared, information that immediately made him the last person confirmed to have had direct contact with her. According to Mark, the meeting was quite brief, with no arguments or tension, and no different in character from previous occasions they had met. Rachel, by his description, appeared completely normal, not anxious, not hurried, and said nothing to suggest she was in any trouble. The detectives recorded this statement with the necessary caution. Full cooperation does not mean a statement is absolutely accurate, but it allowed the investigation to proceed deeper without early confrontation. Mark provided an estimated time frame for the meeting that corresponded reasonably well with some of the witness statements already collected at Cheatham Hill and Barry New Road. To a certain extent, this helped reinforce the assumption that Rachel had been in that area that evening. However, when the detectives began asking about the most critical detail, where they had parted company, the account started to become less clear. Mark could not pinpoint the exact location where they separated. He gave a vague description, saying they parted somewhere near the main road, but was unable to specify a precise spot. When pressed for more detail, he mentioned a few familiar landmarks in the area, yet each one placed the parting at a slightly different location. The detectives did not immediately regard this as evasion, since memory of place, especially in a familiar urban environment, is often muddled. Yet in the context of a timeline already riddled with inexplicable gaps, this uncertainty carried greater weight than usual. If Mark was the last person with Rachel, the place they parted was the bridge between a chain of witnessed events and a void no one had seen. Failure to establish that point made the void even wider. The investigation team cross-referenced Mark's statement with what was already known. The time he gave did not directly contradict bus timetables or shop closing hours, but neither was it precise enough to narrow the search area. When compared with the results of the route search and the scent trail near the River Irk, the vagueness in Mark's account became noteworthy. If the parting had occurred at a logical point on Rachel's usual route, the scent leading her to an unfamiliar area would be hard to explain. Conversely, if the parting had taken place closer to that area, why could Mark not recall a specific location? The detectives asked these questions not to accuse, but to test the resilience of the statement under logical pressure. In subsequent interviews, Mark maintained his cooperative attitude, willing to answer previously asked questions again, yet his responses about the parting location did not become any clearer. He did not alter his story suspiciously, but neither could he add new detail. This placed the team in a difficult position. On one hand, there were no signs Mark was deliberately concealing anything, no major inconsistencies in his account, no defensive reactions, and no obvious motive to lie. On the other, the fact that he was the last confirmed person to have seen Rachel made every ambiguity in his narrative far more significant than it would normally be. The detectives noted another striking point. Mark remembered the conversation with Rachel quite clearly, the content, the general mood, yet could not recall precisely where they parted. In investigative practice, such a discrepancy is often regarded as a detail requiring close scrutiny. People tend to remember clearly what they deem emotionally significant, but overlooked details they did not assign value to at the time. If the parting had occurred in a place that was entirely ordinary to Mark, his failure to remember it precisely would be understandable. But that very ordinariness clashed with the fact that Rachel disappeared immediately afterwards, making the parting location a pivotal detail that memory had failed to retain. When the phase of working with Mark Ellison concluded, the investigation team had no grounds to treat him as a suspect, but neither could they regard his statement as a solid anchor for reconstructing the night Rachel disappeared. He became a significant marker in the file, not because of what he had done, but because of what he could not confirm. The inability to establish where they parted meant last known contact did not lead to a specific point in space. It merely stopped at a blurred zone where Rachel was known to have been with one person, then abruptly fell out of everyone's sight. From here, the investigation entered a more difficult phase, where every unclear detail was no longer seen as a minor memory lapse, but as a gap potentially concealing the very moment Rachel vanished from the world still visible to others. Once Mark Ellison's statement was entered into the official file, the Greater Manchester Police Investigation Team immediately did what they had learned, not to delay after the initial timeline experience. They placed every detail of his account onto the existing timeline and cross-checked it against all available objective data. The aim was not to find contradictions at any cost, but to test how well Mark's story held up under the weight of bus timetables, shop closing times, travel distances, and the other recorded witness statements. On the surface, many points in Mark's account matched surprisingly well. The time frame he gave for the meeting fitted with Rachel being seen in Cheetham Hill by several witnesses. The duration he said they were together did not contradict the fact that Rachel never returned home that night. These details made Mark's statement, at least initially, appear a reasonable piece of the puzzle. But as the detectives began asking more specific questions about the sequence of events, points that could not have happened started to emerge. In one version of his account, Mark said that after parting, Rachel walked in a direction that, if accurate, would have taken her near a bus route still operating at that hour. Yet when checked against the official timetable, that bus had stopped running before the time Mark claimed they separated. In another telling, he described Rachel turning in the opposite direction, which could explain why she did not catch a bus, but placed her in an area where witnesses insisted they had seen her at a time that did not match. These contradictions did not appear as stark opposites, but as small misalignments. A few minutes, a few dozen meters, yet enough to collapse any attempt to lock the timeline definitively. What particularly drew the detectives' attention was how Mark reacted when these misalignments were pointed out. He did not protest, did not deny the data presented, and did not appear unduly flustered. Instead, Mark adjusted his statement very slightly. A time marker became possibly a little earlier. A direction was redescribed as something like that, but I'm not certain. Taken individually, such adjustments could be seen as the natural behavior of someone trying to recall an event under stressful circumstances. But when the detectives overlaid them, a pattern began to form. Each time Mark's account touched a clear contradiction with objective data, he adjusted his story just enough to avoid an impossible situation, yet never so much as to create an entirely new narrative. From a professional standpoint, this was a tricky phenomenon. Human memory is not a perfect recording, and adjusting details when given additional information is not always negative. What was noteworthy here, however, was that Mark's adjustments did not make the timeline any clearer. On the contrary, they kept it in a perpetual half-state, not contradictory enough to be wholly dismissed, yet not precise enough to be locked down. When a time was made to fit the bus schedule, the parting location became vaguer. When a location was described more clearly, the time frame had to shift to avoid clashing with other witness statements. The result was that, despite many hours of cross-checking and adjustment, the team could still not establish a seamless sequence of events beginning with the meeting with Mark and ending at the point Rachel disappeared from all sight. The detectives began to consider the possibility that the problem lay not in any single detail, but in the very structure of the account. Mark might be recounting events as he believed them to be, yet he might also be unconsciously arranging his memories to avoid difficult questions. There was no clear sign he was lying deliberately, but neither was there evidence his memory was stable enough to serve as a foundation for the timeline. In the file, the detectives noted that Mark's statement possessed high flexibility, a cautious phrasing to indicate that it could be bent in multiple directions without fully contradicting itself. This placed the investigation in a temporary deadlock. The last person confirmed to have seen Rachel could not provide a clear endpoint for the chain of events, and every attempt to fit his statement into the timeline led either to gaps or to continual adjustments. Even more troubling was that each time the statement was adjusted, the gap did not disappear, it merely shifted to another position on the timeline. That forced the detectives to ask an uncomfortable question: was the gap in the timeline the result of imperfect memory, or did it reflect a period when something had actually happened that Mark, for whatever reason, could not or would not pinpoint clearly? When this cross-checking phase ended, the investigation team could reach no definitive conclusion about the reliability of Mark Ellison's statement. He was not removed from the list of key witnesses, but neither could he be regarded as the final marker for reconstructing the night Rachel disappeared. His account existed in the file as an element that both connected and fractured the timeline, a story with enough matching points to be impossible to ignore, yet enough impossible points to be impossible to trust completely. And while the detectives continued searching for other pieces of the puzzle, they had to accept an increasingly clear reality. As long as this statement could not be firmly locked into the timeline, the moment Rachel vanished would remain out of reach, obscured by small adjustments that carried far more weight than their appearance suggested. When Mark Ellison's statement could not lock down the timeline, the investigation was forced to expand in the almost inevitable way of every prolonged missing person case. The range of hypotheses was broadened, and with it, the focus began to disperse. Greater Manchester Police could no longer place all their hopes in a single direction when contradictions remained unresolved, so Rachel Hargreaves' file was officially opened to multiple parallel possibilities. Accident was reconsidered once more, particularly in light of the scent trail that had once led near the River Irk. Stretches of river, canals, and other open water areas within Rachel's reasonable range of movement were thoroughly searched, though the results were the same as before. No physical evidence, no witnesses, and no signs that a random incident had occurred. Running parallel was the stranger-related hypothesis. Detectives reviewed reports of suspicious behavior in the Cheetham Hill and Bury New Road areas around the time of Rachel's disappearance, searching for any description that might match an unusual approach. Scattered reports were noted, but nothing specific enough to link directly to Rachel. Each new lead required time to check, interview, and rule out, and in the process, the file thickened rapidly. Transcripts, maps, statements, and reports piled up, forming a massive block of information yet lacking a clear guiding thread. The expansion of the investigation also encompassed the hypothesis that Rachel had left Manchester. Train routes, coach stations, and points she might have accessed if wishing to leave the city were checked. But this hypothesis quickly encountered familiar problems. No evidence of preparation for a journey, no financial signs or contacts indicating she had established a new life elsewhere. While hypotheses were broadened, something important happened quietly. The initial focus of the investigation began to dilute. Instead of drilling deeper into the specific gaps in the timeline and the statement of the last confirmed person, resources were allocated across multiple directions, each with its own justification, but none converging on the same endpoint. This was a familiar phase in complex disappearances, where the absence of a breakthrough forced detectives to cast a wide net in the hope that a small detail somewhere would surface on its own. But the wider the net, the harder it became to see clear connections between core details. Rachel's file grew denser, but not deeper. In that context, Mark Ellison's position in the investigation changed subtly. He was not removed from the list of people of interest, but neither was he the continual focus of ongoing sessions. With no new evidence to charge him, and no contradictions large enough to exclude him, Mark was set aside in the file, noted as the last confirmed person to have met Rachel, and that his statement contained unstable points. This was not a decision made formally or publicly, but the result of the investigation having to divide its attention across multiple directions. Mark did not disappear from the file, but his presence was gradually pushed back behind the new hypothesis under review. For the investigation team, this was an unwanted compromise. Continuing to focus too heavily on one individual without concrete evidence could lead to deadlock or error, but setting it aside also meant accepting that a key link in the chain of events remained unresolved. In internal meetings, Mark's name was still mentioned, but usually only as part of the broader picture rather than the starting point for new lines of inquiry. The file recorded him as a key unresolved witness, a detail that did not fit, but not the most urgent issue in the context of scarce leads. Time passed, and with it came the familiar fatigue of cases that made no progress. Each new hypothesis opened required effort, but rarely yielded proportionate results. Lines of inquiry once hoped to break the deadlock were successively closed or moved to pending status, leaving behind notes that nothing was found. Meanwhile, the original questions, where Rachel had been during the timeline gap, why the scent led to an unfamiliar place, and what happened after the final meeting, remained unanswered. The expansion of hypotheses, rather than advancing the investigation, created an unavoidable sense of stagnation. Rachel Hargreaves' file was not forgotten, but neither was it pursued with the sharp focus of the early days, and in that dilution, a troubling reality took shape. The last person confirmed to have seen Rachel remained there, in the file, neither ruled out, nor charged, quietly existing as an unresolved question mark, waiting for some future point, when the investigation, somehow, would be forced to return and confront what had once been set aside. As the investigation dragged on and hypotheses continued to expand, the operational decisions made in the early phase began to reveal their consequences in ways no one wanted. In Rachel Hargreaves' file, there was an area once considered important, then quickly removed from the priority search list. That was the vicinity where the scent trail had led near the River Irk. After the initial days of searching yielded no clear results, the area was deemed sufficiently checked, and resources were redirected to other directions considered more promising. That decision, at the time it was made, seemed reasonable. No physical evidence, no witnesses, and continuing to focus on a point yielding no concrete results was seen as a waste of time in a context where the investigation needed to broaden. But later, that premature halt became a regrettable milestone. Ceasing the search in that area meant other possibilities were never fully examined. Time passed, weather changed, daily life continued, and any physical traces that might have existed could have been erased. When detectives later reviewed the decision, they realized they had underestimated the value of maintaining presence at an anomalous point, simply because it did not yield immediate results. In disappearances, especially with unclear timelines, removing an area from the search scope does not just close one line of inquiry, it also closes the possibility of returning to it under the same initial conditions. Running parallel to that decision was another oversight, smaller in form, but no less serious in consequence. In the early phase of the investigation, when time pressure and workload were intense, at least one important statement was recorded without a full audio recording. The transcript was based on the receiving officer's notes, reflecting the main content of the exchange, but lacking subsidiary details such as tone, hesitation, or offhand remarks. At the time, no one considered this a major issue. The witness was seen as cooperative, the statement contained no obvious contradictions, and the handwritten transcript was deemed sufficient for later cross-referencing. Only when the timeline continued to show inexplicable gaps did the detectives realize the value of what had not been preserved. Without an audio recording, they could not go back to hear exactly how the witness expressed timings, could not analyze pauses or small changes in narrative. When that statement was compared with others, mismatches appeared only on paper, without context to understand why they arose. The lack of recording also severely limited the ability to re-examine the statement in future, as any re-interview would be influenced by what the witness had since heard or read about the case. These two oversights, taken separately, could be seen as unavoidable decisions in a complex, clue-scarce investigation, but placed together, they revealed a deeper issue, opportunities to gather vital evidence had been lost not through lack of effort, but through hasty assessments under pressure. The search area stopped too soon might have preserved physical traces that needed protecting. The unrecorded statement might have contained small details that only became significant as the overall picture emerged. Once time had passed, both opportunities were irretrievable. In later internal meetings, these decisions were mentioned with cautious tone. No one publicly labeled them mistakes at the time they occurred, but in internal review files, they were noted as steps that, if handled differently, might have given the investigation more options. This created an uncomfortable feeling for those involved from the start, as it highlighted a familiar yet hard-to-accept reality. In investigations, lack of evidence is not always due to a perpetrator being too clever, but sometimes to opportunities that slipped away before their value was recognized. As the case continued without breakthrough, those early operational decisions became part of the investigation's own story. They not only explained why the file thickened yet made no progress, but also showed how time, pressure, and uncertainty could combine to weaken the ability to gather truth. For Rachel Hargreaves, these lost opportunities were not just notes in the file, but doors permanently closed, making the path to understanding what had happened to her narrower, more winding, and more dependent on the remaining fragments. After many months of investigation yielding no breakthrough, Rachel Hargreaves' disappearance gradually slipped into the state no detective wants, but all know is hard to avoid. The file went cold, no new witnesses, no physical discoveries, and the lines of inquiry that had been expanded one by one reached their stopping points. Internal reports from Greater Manchester Police began to change tone, shifting from urgent notes to more cautious lines, emphasizing that every feasible direction had been examined within the limits of available resources. The case was not closed, but it was moved to pending status, a professional term, reflecting the reality that no clear next step could be taken at that time. The classification as a cold case did not happen in a dramatic moment, but as the result of a series of small decisions. Investigation meetings became less frequent, update reports grew shorter, and priority was given to newly arising cases where the opportunity to gather evidence remained intact. Rachel's file was carefully archived, accompanied by summaries to ensure that any future detective taking it over could quickly grasp what had been done. But alongside that neatness came a sense of incompleteness, because the case's largest gaps, the unlocked timeline, the unclear final route, and the unstable statement of the last confirmed person, remained exactly as they were. During this phase, a notable change occurred on the fringes of the investigation. Mark Ellison left Manchester. This was not illegal, nor was it done in secret. Mark told acquaintances he was moving for personal and work reasons, a decision not unusual for a young man. For the police, his departure was noted in the file as an update, not as evidence. There was no restriction order, no requirement to keep him in the city, and at that time no legal basis to regard his leaving as suspicious. Yet in the context of his being the last confirmed person to have met Rachel, the change carried a weight heavier than its surface appearance. Mark's departure from Manchester added further distance between the investigation and one of its most important markers. Face-to-face sessions became harder, and the possibility of cross-checking his statement in the same geographical context was virtually gone. Detectives noted that any re-interview would have to be conducted remotely or through inter-force coordination, a process far slower and less flexible than the initial sessions. Even so, with the file already cold, Mark's move did not alter the case's status. It was simply added to the list of things that had happened, without triggering specific action. When the file was officially classified as a cold case, a series of summary notes was added to help anyone reviewing it in future understand the key points. Among them was a short but striking line, written in cool professional tone, "Revisit later." The note did not specify when nor which point to return to first. It was not a plan, but an acknowledgement that unresolved details remained, decisions had been made in a context of limited information, and that if circumstances changed, if new technology, new witnesses, or a strong enough reason to reopen emerged, the file still had room to continue. For the detectives who had followed the case from the start, seeing that line in the file carried a heavy feeling. It crystallized months of tireless work without result, and served as a reminder that justice does not always arrive when expected. Revisit Later did not explain where Rachel had gone, nor did it clarify the contradictions that had haunted the investigation, but it kept the case from being completely sealed, from being consigned to a drawer and forgotten. As the file was placed in storage, Rachel Hargreaves' story entered a new phase, where time became the dominant factor more than any detective. What remained were papers, notes, and unanswered questions. Mark Ellison was no longer in Manchester. Witnesses had returned to everyday life, and the areas once searched continued to change with the city's rhythm. But within the GMP system, the case still existed as an incomplete entity, marked for return on some future day when there was strong enough reason to open it again. And in that vague waiting, Rachel's cold file retained a fragile possibility that however much time had passed, there remained a chance for what had been missed to be looked at again, and for the long silence surrounding the night she disappeared, not to become the final full stop in the story. Many years after Rachel Hargreaves' missing person file was classified as a cold case, it was brought back into the light, not by a new witness or an accidental discovery, but by a systematic decision. The Cold Case Review Unit of Greater Manchester Police conducted a review of numerous unsolved cases from the 1980s, including Rachel's file. This reopening carried no romantic expectation of a sudden confession or a lingering clue at the scene, but stemmed from a more practical question: whether the decisions made in the context of the procedures and technology of that time still held up when viewed against current standards. The review unit detectives had no emotional connection to the case, carried none of the assumptions formed from the outset, and it was precisely this distance that allowed them to view the file with fresh eyes. The review process began with the most basic elements. The entire file was digitized and reorganized logically, rather than in the chronological order of recording. Statements were placed side by side, not according to previously assigned reliability, but according to their ability to explain or fail to explain known events. Early operational decisions, including the halting of searches in certain areas and the manner of recording statements, were flagged for re-examination, not to assign blame, but to understand how they had affected the overall picture. In this process, one element quickly drew the review team's attention: the gap in the timeline that the original detectives had noted but never satisfactorily explained. This gap was not a few minutes attributable to memory error, but a stretch of time long enough to raise serious questions about where Rachel had been and what she had done. The review team did not approach the gap by asking who lied, but by resetting all objective data around it. They rechecked bus timetables, not only against official schedules, but also operational reports to see if there had been delays, cancellations, or unusual changes on the night Rachel disappeared. They re-examined shop closing times, compared them with area habits in the winter of 1985, and recalculated actual travel times between points. Not based on estimates, but on current measured data. The results forced the review team to pause and examine more closely. The timeline gap could not be filled by transport factors. No bus had been canceled or delayed long enough to account for Rachel's absence during that period. Walking, even at a slow pace, could not stretch to create such a large gap if she was simply moving between the points mentioned in statements. In other words, if Rachel had merely traveled by available roads and public transport, the timeline could not have the shape the file showed. The gap was not a product of urban transport, but a sign of some other interruption that had never been clearly identified. The review team began questioning the very nature of this gap. They returned to statements once deemed sufficient in the early phase, particularly that of Mark Ellison, the last confirmed person to have met Rachel. When his statement was placed on the timeline recalculated with objective data, its instability became clearer than ever. The small adjustments in Mark's account, once seen as natural consequences of imperfect memory, now appeared as factors that prevented the timeline gap from ever being locked down. The review team did not conclude that Mark had deliberately distorted the truth, but they noted that his statement could not account for the period when Rachel vanished from every verifiable point. This led to an important shift in how the case was viewed. In the original file, the timeline gap was often treated as a consequence of missing witnesses or data, something not uncommon in disappearances. But through review, it began to be seen as an active element, part of the story that needed explaining, rather than a random void that could be overlooked. The review team noted that if the gap could not be explained by transport, habits, or ordinary memory error, then some event or sequence of events must have occurred during that time which the current file had not yet touched. The reopening also involved re-examining details once judged secondary. The small item cursorily noted in the list of things Rachel had not taken was brought back for discussion, not because it held great value in itself, but because it tied into the question of where Rachel intended to go, and for how long. The review detectives also revisited the decision to halt the search early near the River Irk, asking whether the lack of results at the time was truly enough to exclude the area from all hypotheses. These questions were not intended to rewrite investigative history, but to determine whether certain points needed reapproaching with modern tools and thinking. When the review concluded its initial phase, the Cold Case Review Unit did not produce an immediate solution. Instead, they reached an important consensus. The gap in Rachel Hargreaves' timeline was not a technical error or minor inaccuracy, but a core unresolved issue. It could not be accounted for by transport, daily habits, or ordinary memory discrepancies. This transformed the gap from an irritating detail into a central clue, something capable of connecting the scattered contradictions in the file into a more coherent narrative. The reopening of the file, therefore, was not merely an act of returning to what had been done, but an acknowledgement that a significant part of the night Rachel disappeared had never been properly understood, and that to move forward, the investigation would have to start from the very gap that for many years everyone had learned to live with, without being able to explain. The Cold Case Review Unit's identification of the timeline gap as the core issue forced a change in investigative direction. Instead of continuing to search for new witnesses to a night that had passed decades ago, the review team turned back to what still existed in the file: old physical evidence. These were items once collected, recorded, then set aside because they did not fit the hypotheses of the time or could not be explained within the limitations of contemporary procedures. Among them were very small objects, nothing shocking, but sharing one common feature: they were directly linked to Rachel's behavior rather than to others' accounts. The item once cursorily noted in the list of things Rachel had not taken was retrieved from storage and placed back on the analysis table. At the original time, it was not considered pivotal because it indicated no violence and did not point to a specific location. But when the review team approached it with a new question, where Rachel had been during the timeline gap, the significance of this evidence began to shift. Rather than viewing it as a forgotten object, the detectives considered it as a sign of movement and timing. They analyzed how Rachel typically used the item in daily life, when she carried it, and the places she had reasonable cause to use it. The analysis was conducted using methods unavailable to the original investigation. Residual microscopic traces were re-examined, not to search for DNA directly, but to determine the environment the item had contacted. The results indicated no violence, but showed the item had been exposed to a geographical area inconsistent with previous hypotheses. The data did not point towards Harper Hay, Cheetham Hill, or the area near the River Irk, as the original lines of inquiry had focused. Instead, the environmental indicators began converging on a different area north of Manchester, Prestwich. This discovery made the review team pause and cross-check carefully. Prestwich did not lie on any of Rachel's familiar routes according to her lifestyle file. It also did not appear in witness statements or Mark Ellison's account. Throughout the original investigation, Prestwich had never been considered relevant, simply because no data placed Rachel there. That was why the old evidence pointing to Prestwich carried special meaning. It suggested Rachel might have been in a place no one had ever searched, during a period unrecorded by any statement. The review team re-examined the original investigation map and confirmed something troubling. Prestwich had never been within the official search scope. No area searches, no witnesses interviewed there, no hypothesis ever placing Rachel in Prestwich. This was not because the area did not exist in reality, but because all initial data had pulled the investigation in other directions. When the scent trail led near the River Irk, and the timeline revolved around Cheetham Hill, Bury New Road, Prestwich simply lay outside the field of vision. The fact that old evidence opened up an entirely new location forced the review team to re-evaluate the original investigation's entire structure. If Rachel had gone to Prestwich, it meant she had left familiar routes very early in the night of her disappearance, or had been taken in a way that left no trace on the routes once searched. This also provided a more plausible explanation for the timeline gap, not time lost due to transport or faulty memory, but time Rachel spent in a space never placed on the investigative map. The review team cross-referenced this discovery with Mark Ellison's file. Prestwich did not directly contradict his statement, but was not supported by it either. The vagueness in pinpointing the parting location became more significant than ever, because if the parting had occurred near a connection leading to Prestwich, the entire picture would change. However, since the area had never been investigated, no witness data existed to confirm or deny that possibility. Prestwich appeared in the file as a blank space, not because it was irrelevant, but because it had never been looked at. When the Cold Case Review Unit completed the evidence analysis, they reached a cautious but groundbreaking conclusion. There was sufficient basis to believe the original investigation had missed a key area. Prestwich was not just a new place name, but a symbol of what might have been overlooked when the investigative focus was pulled towards hypotheses leading nowhere. The fact that an item once dismissed pointed to a place never searched set a clear requirement for the next phase. The investigation must expand into directions the old file had never touched. This discovery did not provide an immediate answer to where Rachel had gone or what had happened to her, but it achieved something more important. It broke the old orbit of the case and forced the investigation to step into a new location with new questions. Prestwich, for many years existing only as a marginal name, now became the potential focal point of a belated search, where the fragile hope remained that what had been missed might still leave traces, waiting to be seen for the first time. The emergence of Prestwich in the file as a location, never considered, forced the Cold Case Review Unit to return to a figure who, for many years, had existed only on the edges of the investigation, Mark Ellison. Not because new evidence directly implicated him, but because any plausible scenario, taking Rachel off familiar routes, had to pass through the last point she was confirmed to have company. When the decision to summon Mark was made, it was cautious and procedural, not persecutory. He had left Manchester long ago, his life had taken a different path, and the police call evoked a chapter many believed time had buried. The session took place in an atmosphere quite different from previous interviews. No longer the pressure of the early missing hours, no longer the fatigue of an investigation racing against time. Instead, a quiet space where each question was posed with careful preparation. Mark was as cooperative as before, even more proactive, ready to detail what he remembered about Rachel and the evening they met. The detectives noticed immediately that Mark had prepared for this meeting. He was not flustered by old questions repeated, and his answers seemed smoother, more coherent than those recorded in the original file. When Mark's new statement was placed alongside the file, something noteworthy quickly emerged. The timings he gave this time aligned almost perfectly with what the Cold Case Review Unit had reconstructed during the review. The small discrepancies that had prevented the timeline from locking down seemed to have vanished. Mark pinpointed the meeting time with Rachel more clearly, described a more logical route, and especially offered an explanation that sounded highly plausible for Rachel deviating from her usual path. On the surface, this new statement was like the missing piece the investigation had sought for years. But it was precisely this perfect fit that made the detectives wary. In professional practice, natural memory rarely becomes more accurate over time, especially after decades. Details usually fade, not sharpen. When pressed deeper on sensory elements, lighting, sounds, emotions at the parting moment, Mark began to slow. He could speak fluently about Rachel heading in a direction that fitted the investigative map, but struggled when asked why he remembered it that way. When requested to describe the surroundings at the parting point, his answers became vague, lacking the random details real memory often carries. The detectives shifted questioning approach, not asking what happened, but how do you recall it? It was here that a clear discrepancy appeared. Mark remembered very clearly what the file had recorded, the timings, locations mentioned in previous sessions, and even the once contested points. But when detached from that framework, when asked about details not in the file, unrecorded moments, things that could only come from direct experience, he became hesitant. There were questions he paused long over before answering, and when answers came, they often circled back to what was already known. This created an uncomfortable feeling in the interview room. No clear contradiction to confront, no obvious lie to unpack. Instead, an excessive smoothness, as if the statement were built on knowledge of the case, rather than memory of the event. The detectives noted that Mark neither denied nor evaded any question, but he seemed to remember the file's story better than the night Rachel disappeared. The difference was subtle enough that without the full context of the cold case review, it could easily have been overlooked. When the session ended, Mark was not detained, not charged, and no immediate legal action was taken. But in internal notes, the cold case review unit marked this interview as a turning point. Mark's new statement was not rejected, but neither was it accepted as a solution. It raised a more fundamental question than specific timings or locations. Was Mark recounting what he remembered, or what he had learned from the case file over the years? That difference carried profound implications for the next investigative direction. If the statement were based on real memory, it should contain imperfections, extraneous details, even random errors. But if reconstructed from the file, it would tend towards smoothness, logic, and suspiciously good fit with what was recorded. The re-interview brought no confession or explosive contradiction, but it gave the investigation something no less important, a sign that the boundary between memory and knowledge in Mark's story might have been blurred. When the cold case review unit compiled the results, they did not record that Mark was lying. They recorded that his statement was not independent of the file. That was a cautious assessment, but enough to change how his role in the case was viewed. The person once set aside in the cold file was no longer merely an old witness, but a point of intersection between the investigation's past and present, where surface accuracy concealed a deeper issue. If someone remembers the file better than the event, then what remains untold might lie precisely in the part of memory they can no longer access, or no longer wish to access. The emergence of Prestwich from the physical evidence analysis forced the cold case review unit to do what the original investigation had never done: approach this area as a central space, rather than a peripheral point outside the route. During the review of local records, one specific location quickly drew the detective's attention: an old garage in a residential area of Prestwich that had been under Mark Ellison's use shortly after Rachel's disappearance. On paper, it was entirely innocuous, not a recorded scene of violence, no history of complaints, and for many years used merely as storage before being abandoned. It was precisely this ordinariness that had kept it from ever appearing on previous investigative maps. The decision to search the garage was made with a high degree of caution. There was no expectation of finding a body, as too much time had passed. The purpose of the search was not to uncover a complete answer, but to determine whether this space had played any role in the timeline gap. When the old metal door was opened, the detective stepped into a dust-covered area, where the smell of damp and old engine oil mingled in the air. Everything bore the marks of long neglect: rotting wooden shelves, a few torn cardboard boxes, and signs of rodents. Nothing immediately evoked the image of a crime. The search was conducted strictly by procedure, with every section checked and every surface documented. As anticipated, there was no body, no obvious personal items belonging to Rachel, and no direct evidence of violence. If it had stopped there, the garage could easily have been added to the list of locations checked but yielding no results, like many others in this prolonged investigation. But the cold case review unit was not looking for the obvious. They were seeking small details that did not belong in the ordinary context of an abandoned space. It was during this process that the detectives began noting signs inconsistent with the story that Rachel had voluntarily left. Certain surfaces in the garage showed evidence of selective cleaning: uneven compared to the general deterioration of the space. There were wear marks on the concrete floor disproportionate to mere storage use, as though a heavy object had been dragged or moved back and forth for a short period before stopping entirely. These signs were not enough on their own to prove a crime, but they raised the question of why a seemingly useless garage bore traces of use inconsistent with its function. More importantly, when these details were cross-referenced with Rachel's behavioral file, a clear incompatibility emerged. Nothing in Rachel's life or habits indicated any reason for her to voluntarily go to an abandoned garage in Prestwich, especially on a winter evening. She had no friends living in the area, no regular activities connected to it, and no signs she was seeking a secret temporary refuge. If Rachel had appeared here, it could not have been the result of a spontaneous decision or a prepared departure. The detectives returned to the case's core question: if Rachel had not left voluntarily, what had happened during the timeline gap? The garage in Prestwich, with its discreet yet not overly isolated position, began to emerge as an intermediate space, not a final destination, but a place that might have been used temporarily. This helped explain why the scent trail had vanished in an unfamiliar area, and why no witnesses placed Rachel in Prestwich. It was not a place she traveled publicly, but one to which she might have been taken. The search also shed further light on a detail once downplayed in the runaway hypothesis analysis. The signs in the garage indicated that if Rachel had been there, she had no control over the space. There was no arrangement suggesting voluntary stay, no living items, no signs of habitation, and no convenient access for someone wishing to come and go unnoticed. On the contrary, everything evoked the image of a place used briefly for a specific purpose, and then abandoned. When the detectives compiled the search results, they did not record the garage as a traditional crime scene. They recorded it as a point incompatible with the hypothesis that Rachel had disappeared voluntarily. This was a crucial distinction. Rather than seeking direct evidence of crime, they were finding evidence that old hypotheses no longer held. The garage in Prestwich, with all its outward ordinariness, had achieved that. It did not prove what had happened, but it significantly narrowed what could not have happened. The absence of a body did not weaken the value of this discovery. In the context of a disappearance spanning decades, the lack of a body was almost inevitable. What mattered more were the signs that Rachel had not chosen the path leading here, and that her presence, if any, was passive rather than active. This created a clear shift in the case approach, from searching for someone who had left to investigating someone who had been taken. As they left the old garage in Prestwich, the detectives carried away little physical evidence, but more questions than ever. This space, once considered so innocuous it was not worth mentioning, had now become a vital piece in the new picture forming. It did not answer where Rachel was, but it answered a question that had haunted the investigation for years. She had not disappeared voluntarily. And with that realization, the case officially entered a different phase, where the search for truth was no longer constrained by the runaway hypothesis, but guided by increasingly clear signs of intervention from another hand. The inclusion of the old garage in Prestwich in the file did not provide a clear crime scene, but it forced the cold case review unit to do what no one had fully achieved in many years: reconstruct the entire night of Rachel Hargreaves' disappearance as a single chain of events, not based on assumptions, but on what could not have been otherwise. Instead of trying to reconcile every statement and every possibility, the detectives applied a stricter approach. They began eliminating, not asking what might have happened, but what could not have happened. They returned to the familiar starting point, the flat in Harper Hay. Rachel left home without coat, handbag, or money. This ruled out the possibility she intended to stay away longer than a few hours. From there, they placed Rachel on the most logical movement trajectory in the early evening, based on confirmed habits. The statements placing her in Cheetham Hill and Barry New Road were not entirely discarded, but rearranged by compatibility with objective data. The detectives accepted that some witnesses might have mistaken times, but not all in the same way. This allowed them to establish a relatively narrow window in which Rachel was certainly outside Harper Hay and had not returned. Next was the meeting with Mark Ellison. Throughout the review, no evidence emerged that Mark had fabricated the meeting with Rachel. On the contrary, his status as the last confirmed person with her remained solid. What changed was how that meeting was placed in the timeline. Instead of trying to pinpoint the parting location based on Mark's unstable statement, the detectives asked the reverse. At that point, where could Rachel have gone if she did not continue on her familiar route? The answer no longer lay in Cheatham Hill or Barry New Road, as those routes did not account for the timeline gap. That gap, after ruling out transport and ordinary memory errors, had to be filled by something else, a period when Rachel was not moving freely. When this assumption was placed in the timeline, many once contradictory details began to align naturally. The scent trail vanishing near the River Irk was no longer seen as the endpoint, but as the point Rachel left public space. The fact that Prestwich appeared in no statements became logical, because if Rachel had not gone there voluntarily, there was no reason for witnesses to see her. The old garage, with its signs of short-term use inconsistent with voluntary habitation, began to serve as an intermediate point in the chain. When the detectives placed the garage in the timeline, they realized only one scenario allowed all pieces to coexist without contradiction. Rachel left home intending to return. She met Mark Ellison in a time frame fitting some initial statements. Afterwards, instead of continuing on her usual route, she was led or taken out of public space during the timeline gap, the period with no buses, no witnesses, and no objective data recording her free movement. From there, Rachel appeared in Prestwich, not as someone choosing a destination, but as someone taken to a place not her own. What made this scenario credible was not a new detail, but how it explained everything that had once caused deadlock. It accounted for why the runaway hypothesis did not fit her behavior. It accounted for why the timeline could never be locked, despite repeated cross-checking. It accounted for why Mark's statement could always be adjusted to avoid contradiction, but never specific enough to clarify the truth. And most importantly, it accounted for why the original investigation, despite effort, could not find the answer, because they had searched for Rachel in places she might have gone, rather than where she had been taken. When reconstructing the entire 1985 night according to this scenario, the detectives realized something more haunting than any new discovery. Every clue needed to reach this conclusion had existed from the start. The timeline gap had been recorded. Mark's unstable statement had been filed. The scent trail leading to an unfamiliar point had been found. The downplayed personal item had been noted, albeit cursorily, and the hypothesis that Rachel had not left voluntarily had been raised, then pushed aside for lack of direct evidence. No new piece had appeared, only the arrangement of them had changed. This realization brought a heavy feeling to those reviewing the file. It was not blame directed at the original investigation, but a reminder of the limits of perceiving truth when bound by the wrong hypothesis. When one hypothesis dominates, all data are forced to fit it, and what does not fit is treated as exception. Only when that hypothesis is eliminated, can the picture be reassembled differently, more clearly. By this point, the Cold Case Review Unit no longer spoke of possibilities. They spoke of the single sequence of events that could have occurred if everything recorded was true. That sequence was not speculative, but the result of eliminating every path that could not exist. And in that sequence, Rachel Hargreaves did not disappear randomly, nor did she leave her old life of her own accord. She disappeared during a period that had been present in the file from the beginning, as an uncomfortable gap, waiting to be recognized not as an investigative error, but as the very place where the truth had been obscured for many years. The decision to arrest Mark Ellison was not made in a moment of impulse or under public pressure, but as the result of a prolonged series of legal evaluations, in which the Cold Case Review Unit had to ask itself whether the picture they had just reconstructed was robust enough to cross the highest threshold in criminal law. Once the single possible sequence of events had been established, the question was no longer what might have happened, but whether there were reasonable grounds to believe Mark Ellison had been involved in criminal conduct. The answer came from the convergence of multiple factors, none strong enough in isolation, but together forming a consistent legal foundation. First was position and opportunity. Mark was the last person confirmed to have met Rachel Hargreaves within the time frame fitting the timeline gap. This gap, after ruling out transport and ordinary memory errors, could only be explained by Rachel no longer moving freely. Mark's initial inability to pinpoint the parting location, followed later by descriptions that fitted the file too perfectly, placed him in a unique position, the only person present at the junction between public space and the period when Rachel vanished from all objective records. Second was post-event behavior. Mark left Manchester during the period when the case went cold, an action not criminal in itself, but which took on different meaning when set against the ambiguities in his statements, and the fact that Prestwich had never been investigated. His continued cooperation while repeatedly adjusting his account to avoid contradictions, and especially his ability to recall the file better than personal memory, was viewed as indicative of narrative control rather than natural recollection. Third was the location connection. The old garage in Prestwich, under Mark's use during the relevant period, was not a traditional crime scene, but a space consistent with the scenario of Rachel being removed from public view during the timeline gap. The signs of short-term use inconsistent with voluntary habitation, combined with Prestwich's complete absence from the original investigation, reinforced the view that this was a missed link rather than a newly fabricated hypothesis. Finally was the internal consistency of the sequence of events. The single possible scenario was not based on new speculation, but on rearranging clues that had existed from the beginning. This satisfied the legal requirement of reasonable grounds to suspect there was no need to prove guilt at the point of arrest, but there was a need to demonstrate reasonable grounds to believe Mark Ellison had been directly involved in conduct depriving Rachel Hargreaves of her liberty, against her will. With these grounds, the arrest warrant was approved. Mark Ellison was arrested under tightly controlled conditions, strictly by procedure, with clear notification of his statutory rights. There was no confrontation, no unusual developments. The arrest proceeded as a necessary procedural step to move the case from investigative inference to legal verification. At the time of arrest, Mark was informed of the reason for his detention: suspicion of involvement in false imprisonment and serious offenses arising from Rachel Hargreaves' disappearance. Police explained that the arrest was based on new findings from the cold case review, including reanalysis of the timeline, physical evidence, and statements. Mark was given access to a solicitor and reminded of his right to silence, with these rights fully recorded in the minutes. In the sessions following arrest, detectives did not seek an immediate confession. Their focus was cross-checking, comparing Mark's current statement with what he had said in the past, comparing his descriptions with the reconstructed sequence of events, and comparing his reactions to details only someone involved could know. The arrest allowed them to ask questions that previously could only remain hypothetical, and to test whether the perfectly fitting story held up without a safe margin for retreat. What mattered was that at this stage the case was not defined by emotion or moral judgment, it was defined by legal threshold. The arrest of Mark Ellison was not a final declaration of guilt, but an acknowledgement that the evidence had reached the level requiring judicial intervention. From this point, the story no longer belonged to unexplained gaps but entered a different space, where every detail would face rigorous scrutiny in court. Once the arrest procedure was complete, Rachel Hargreaves' file officially left cold case status in operational terms, not because every question had been answered, but because for the first time in decades, a specific individual had to face legal accountability for what happened on that winter night in 1985. And it was precisely this shift, from speculation to procedure, from hypothesis to grounds, that marked an irreversible turning point in the case, where truth was no longer sought in the gaps but tested within the framework of the law. The arrest of Mark Ellison did not mean the case was ready to enter the courtroom. On the contrary, it was merely the starting point for the most difficult phase, building a prosecution file in a no-body case. For the Crown Prosecution Service, this was the type of file requiring the highest level of caution, as the entire matter had to stand up in court based solely on chain of logic, circumstantial evidence, and the internal consistency of the investigative narrative. CPS did not ask whether Mark might have done something, but whether the existing evidence was strong enough to convince a jury that no reasonable alternative scenario existed. The evaluation process began with CPS reviewing the entire file from the beginning, almost detached from the emotion and momentum of the investigation. What police saw as breakthroughs had to be transformed into tight legal arguments. The absence of a body meant inability to prove cause of death in the traditional sense, but English law allows prosecution if it can be shown that the victim died, and that death was a consequence of criminal conduct. Thus, CPS's focus was not on the question how did Rachel die, but on is it reasonable to believe Rachel is still alive and voluntarily disappeared. Prosecutors began by examining the logic of the victim's behavior. They analyzed in detail what Rachel had done before disappearing, and more importantly, what she had not done. Leaving home without coat, handbag, money or documents, was placed in the context of a winter evening in Manchester in 1985. CPS argued that this behavior was incompatible with any voluntary scenario lasting more than a few hours. Rachel's failure to contact family, friends, or any authority in the years afterwards further undermined the runaway hypothesis. From a legal standpoint, this formed the foundation for asserting that Rachel's disappearance was not her own choice. Next was the logic of opportunity and control. CPS examined Mark Ellison's role as the last confirmed person to have met Rachel. They did not rely solely on his statements, but set them against the timeline gap proven inexplicable by transport or ordinary memory errors. Prosecutors argued that the gap could only exist if Rachel had been separated from public space for a significant period. In every reasonable scenario considered, Mark was the only person with direct opportunity to create that interruption. A key part of the prosecution file was the evolution of the statements. CPS did not accuse Mark of lying in a simple sense, but pointed out that his account had changed in ways that reduced contradictions with the file over time. The fact that a witness remembered the story increasingly matching what was recorded, while unable to recreate independent sensory details, was presented as a sign that the statement did not arise from natural memory. In a legal context, this did not need to prove intent to deceive, but only to show that the statement was unreliable for creating a reasonable alternative scenario. CPS also scrutinized the role of the Prestwich location, particularly the old garage once under Mark's use. They did not present the garage as a murder scene, but as a space allowing a reasonable explanation for Rachel vanishing from public view. The absence of a body did not weaken this argument, as prosecution did not need to prove where Rachel died, but that she had been controlled and unable to leave freely. The signs of short-term use inconsistent with voluntary habitation were included as circumstantial evidence, supporting the argument that Rachel had not gone there of her own accord. The pivotal element in building the file was how CPS handled the old flaws of the original investigation. Rather than viewing them as weaknesses, prosecutors turned them into circumstantial evidence. The early halting of a search area, the incomplete recording of a statement, and Prestwich never entering the original scope were presented as reasons why the case had not been clarified sooner. More importantly, they showed that the lack of direct evidence was not because no crime occurred, but because opportunities to gather evidence had been missed. In CPS's argument, those very gaps increased the value of the remaining circumstantial evidence, as they explained why a complete picture could not exist from the start. Prosecutors also prepared to counter expected defense arguments that there was no body, no direct witnesses, and no forensic proof of death. CPS countered that in no-body cases, courts do not require perfect evidence, but a reasonable non-contradictory chain of inference. When every alternative hypothesis, voluntary departure, accident, intervention by an unidentified stranger, failed to stand against the evidence, the jury had the right to conclude that the defendant caused the victim's disappearance and death. When the evaluation concluded, CPS reached the decision that the file met the threshold of realistic prospect of conviction. This was not a certain assertion of trial outcome, but an acknowledgement that the evidence was strong enough for a reasonable jury to convict. With this decision, the case officially moved to the prosecution phase. For Rachel Hargreaves' file, this held special meaning. After decades existing as a collection of unanswered questions, it had now become a complete legal narrative, where flaws, gaps, and once downplayed details were rearranged into a single argument. No body was needed to tell that story, only logic tight enough to show that Rachel had not disappeared randomly, and that her long silence was the direct consequence of criminal conduct. The trial opened not with a shocking revelation, but with deliberate slowness. For the prosecution, this was a no-body case, and everything depended on their ability to guide the jury through a chain of logical arguments, without the familiar anchor of a body or forensic conclusions. From the outset, CPS established a clear strategy, not to tell an emotional story, but to reconstruct a single possible timeline, step by step, so that the jury would reach the conclusion themselves that no other reasonable scenario remained. The prosecution began with the winter evening of 1985 in Harperhe. Rachel Hargreaves left home in a completely normal state, without taking the items necessary for a prolonged departure. This was not presented as a tragic detail, but as a behavioral fact. From there, the prosecution led the jury through the mismatched last-seen sightings, not to prove witnesses lied, but to show the limits of human memory, and why relying on individual statements had caused the original investigation to stall. Then the prosecution focused on the gap in the timeline, the period inexplicable by transport, habits, or ordinary memory errors. Here the argument became tighter. The prosecutor explained that if Rachel had still been moving freely during this time, there would have to be at least one objective trace, a bus journey, a witness, a transaction, or contact. But there was nothing. That gap could only exist if Rachel had left public space, and the only person confirmed to have been at the boundary before that gap was Mark Ellison. The prosecution did not immediately assert guilt, but let the logic lead. When moving to Prestwich, the prosecution was particularly careful. The old garage was not described as a murder scene, but as a location that explained the disappearance. There was no evidence Rachel had lived there, no signs she stayed voluntarily, and no reasonable reason for her to go there on her own. The prosecution emphasized that in criminal law, proving the defendant caused death does not require pinpointing the exact place or method, but requires proving the defendant's actions deprived the victim of liberty and life. When it was the defense's turn, their strategy was deployed immediately: attack memory. Mark Ellison's lawyer stressed the decades-long time gap, the inconsistencies of witnesses, and the fact that the file had undergone multiple reviews. They questioned whether faded memories could be relied upon to convict someone. They also emphasized that there was no body, no weapon, and no direct witnesses to any violence. According to the defense argument, everything the prosecution presented was inference pieced together afterwards. The defense focused particularly on Mark Ellison. They portrayed him as a cooperative witness who had answered every question and had never been proven to lie. The changes in his statements over time were explained as the natural consequence of exposure to the file and repeated interviews. They argued that remembering the story better than sensory details was not evidence of guilt, but normal when an event occurred so long ago. The trial became most tense when Mark Ellison took the witness stand. The cross-examination was not aggressively confrontational, but resembled a memory test. The defense lawyer guided Mark through familiar timelines, and he answered fluently. But when the prosecution took their turn, the questioning direction changed completely. Instead of asking what happened, they asked why he remembered it that way. The questions were not designed to create contradictions, but to separate personal memory from knowledge of the file. It was here that one question was posed, simple enough not to draw immediate attention. On that night, when you and Rachel parted, what made you remember it was that time rather than earlier or later? Mark paused. He did not cite a feeling, a sound, or a random detail. Instead, he answered by referencing a timestamp that had appeared in the investigative file. The prosecution did not interrupt, merely asking him to elaborate, but no further explanation was given beyond what had already been recorded. That question did not accuse Mark, nor did it expose an obvious lie, but it revealed what the entire trial had revolved around: the boundary between memory and a learned story. In that moment, the jury did not need to believe Mark had deliberately deceived. They only needed to recognize that his statement was not independent of the file, and if the statement of the last person with Rachel could not stand as independent memory, then every alternative scenario the defense proposed lost its foundation. As the trial moved towards closing arguments, the prosecution returned to their core message. They were not asking the jury to believe in a perfect story, but in a chain of logic that could not be broken. Rachel Hargreaves did not disappear voluntarily. The gap in the timeline could not exist if she remained free. Mark Ellison was the only person with direct opportunity at that pivotal point, and every other hypothesis required believing Rachel had done something inconsistent with her behavior, left no trace, and contacted no one for decades. The trial did not end with noise or outward drama. It ended in the heavy silence of a room where all the pieces had been placed correctly. There was no longer a question of what might have happened. There remained only one question for the jury: whether any other reasonable scenario existed. And that question, formed from a patient and dispassionate chain of argument, locked the case in a way no single piece of evidence could. The verdict was delivered after prolonged deliberation, during which the jury was required to consider the entire case, not on emotion or assumption, but on the legal standard of a nobody case. When they returned to the courtroom, there was no lengthy explanation. There was only a single conclusion on Mark Ellison's criminal responsibility for Rachel Hargreaves' disappearance. The court accepted the prosecution's argument that the circumstantial evidence, when viewed as a unified whole, had reached the threshold of beyond reasonable doubt. The sentence was not based on pinpointing the exact time or place of Rachel's death, nor did it require proof of the method. Instead, the verdict rested on proving that Rachel had been deprived of liberty against her will, that she had no ability to leave or contact the outside world, and that this state could only be the consequence of deliberate conduct by the defendant. The court determined that in the context of this case, the absence of a body did not weaken the conclusion on the charges, as the behavioral and circumstantial evidence had ruled out every other reasonable possibility. The bench noted that the single possible timeline, as presented by the prosecution, was not speculative hypothesis, but the result of systematically eliminating unsustainable scenarios. Rachel leaving home without items necessary for prolonged departure, the inexplicable gap in the timeline, the complete absence of any signs of life for decades, and Mark Ellison's central role at the pivotal point before Rachel vanished, were considered as a continuous logical chain. The court emphasized that each element alone might not suffice for conviction, but combined they formed a picture unbreakable by defense arguments. In the judgment, the court also addressed the evaluation of the defendant's statements. There was no conclusion that Mark Ellison had perjured himself directly. However, the court accepted the prosecution's view that the defendant's statements could not be regarded as independent memory, but were significantly influenced by the case file itself. The excessive alignment between the statements and investigative documents, together with the inability to recreate independent sensory details, diminished the evidential value of these statements in supporting any reasonable alternative scenario. The sentence also acknowledged the flaws of the original investigation, including the early halting of searches in certain areas and the incomplete recording of some statements. However, the court determined that these flaws did not give rise to reasonable doubt about the defendant's guilt. On the contrary, they explained why the case had not been resolved sooner, rather than weakening the argument that criminal conduct had occurred. The later Cold Case Review Unit's rearrangement of old clues and reconstruction of the sequence of events was not viewed as arbitrarily creating new evidence, but as legitimately exploiting data already in the file. When passing sentence, the court applied the penalty framework appropriate to the established charges, emphasizing that this was the direct legal consequence of depriving liberty, leading to the victim's death. The sentence contained no moral judgment or social commentary. It merely established Mark Ellison's individual responsibility before the law, with the consequence of deprivation of liberty for the statutory term. Provisions for the right of appeal were clearly explained, along with relevant timelines and legal procedures. The verdict also marked the official end of cold case status for Rachel Hargreaves' file. Legally, the case was no longer regarded as an unsolved disappearance, but as a criminal case concluded in court. This carried administrative consequences, including updating national missing persons records and adjusting the legal status of the matter in the justice system. The court made no findings on whether Rachel's body might be found in future or required the defendant to provide further information beyond what had been examined within the trial framework. The judgment was limited to the scope of proven criminal responsibility and concluded by noting that the justice system had fulfilled its function based on the available evidence. When the trial ended, there was no emotionally charged summation. There was only an established legal reality. One person had been convicted on a rigorously tested chain of logical argument, and a case spanning decades had been resolved within the framework of the law. Not with absolute certainty, but by the highest standard the law requires, beyond reasonable doubt, the Rachel Hargreaves case has been closed within the legal framework. But what remains after the verdict is not a sense of victory or relief, but a cold reckoning of the investigative biases that accumulated over time. There was no single error large enough to derail the case from the outset. Instead, it was a chain of decisions that were reasonable in their contemporary context. But when placed alongside one another, they created an inertia that pushed the truth out of sight. The runaway hypothesis was not chosen because the evidence was strong, but because it was convenient. It allowed the investigation to explain the absence of traces by that very absence. The first bias lay in the approach to the timeline. From the earliest days, the gaps in time were noted, but not treated as a central issue requiring explanation, rather as a consequence of witness memory and data limitations. When the timeline was constructed to fit the hypothesis, rather than the hypothesis being tested against the timeline, the investigation locked itself into an orbit. Each new statement was not used to re-examine the foundational questions, but to patch into a pre-shaped frame. The second bias lay in the assessment of behavior. The things Rachel did not take with her, did not do, did not contact, all appeared in the file, but were treated as minor details because they did not directly point to criminality. Only when the investigation was restarted from scratch did those non-occurrences gain their proper value, not as evidence of voluntary disappearance, but as evidence of no preparation for departure. The third bias was in the geography of the investigation. Prestwich was not excluded because it had been checked and yielded nothing. It was excluded because it was never looked at. When focus was drawn to familiar routes and logical points, spaces that did not fit the simple hypothesis were overlooked. The old garage in Prestwich was not a place of sophisticated concealment. It was simply a location that did not appear on the initial mental map of the investigation. The fourth bias, and perhaps the most dangerous, was familiarity with the file. When a case drags on, the file gradually becomes the official story, and those involved, both investigators and witnesses, unwittingly remember that story, rather than the original events. Mark Ellison's testimony did not collapse because of contradictions, but because it was too consistent. It reflected a clear professional risk. When the file becomes the standard of memory, personal truth is eroded without any need for deliberate falsehood. From this case, the professional lesson does not lie in new techniques or advanced technology, but in intellectual discipline. Investigation is not merely gathering more facts, but continually asking whether the initial assumptions still hold. A cold case does not necessarily need new clues. Sometimes it only needs to be looked at again, without carrying the old convictions. The fact that the Cold Case Review Unit did not seek anything new, but rearranged what already existed, is proof of the power of this approach. The case also reminds us that errors are not always individual faults. Many decisions in the original investigation were entirely reasonable, given the resources, knowledge, and time pressures of the 1980s. But the justice system only progresses when it dares to acknowledge that what was reasonable yesterday can become a blind spot today. Independent review mechanisms, the ability to return to files thought to be closed, are not a repudiation of the past, but a responsibility to the present. Ultimately, what remains after everything is not the image of a convicted perpetrator, but the realization that truth does not vanish with time. It can be obscured by convenient hypotheses, by professional habits, by the fatigue of long years without results. But it still exists, waiting for a very specific moment When someone is willing to go back, ignore the old ruts, and look at the place that was once overlooked. Truth does not disappear, it only waits until someone comes back to look in the right place. The story of Rachel Hargreaves is not just a cold case solved late, but a very clear mirror reflecting life in the United Kingdom today, where people increasingly trust systems, data, and reasonable logic, but sometimes forget to ask the right questions at the right time. In this case, the bias did not begin with malice or carelessness, but with familiar assumptions. The runaway hypothesis was accepted because it was convenient, because it explained the lack of evidence without forcing the system to examine itself. This is something that still happens in modern society, when a story that seems reasonable is believed more quickly than a complex and uncomfortable truth. The detail that Rachel left home without a coat, money, or personal belongings seemed minor, yet was overlooked for many years. This reflects a very practical lesson for life in Britain today. Unusual signals in human behavior are not always loud, they are often quiet, and only gain value when we pause to look closely. Just like the old garage in Prestwich, a location seemingly irrelevant because it did not appear on the initial mental map, in modern life, many risks and injustices exist in places we no longer notice, in familiar neighborhoods, old relationships, or stories that have been labeled finished. The case also sends an important message about collective responsibility. Justice does not always arrive on time, but it only has a chance if society accepts the need to look back, correct mistakes, and question old conclusions. In the context of the United Kingdom today, from police reform, mental health care, to protecting the vulnerable, the lesson from Rachel Hargreaves is clear. Do not let familiarity paralyze vigilance, and do not take prolonged silence as evidence of voluntariness. Truth may come late, but only when people are patient enough and brave enough to go back and look in the right place. If you believe that stories like Rachel Hargreaves need to be retold so that truth is not buried with time, please subscribe to the channel to join us on the journey of revisiting cases that seem to have fallen into silence. Thank you for watching to the end, and see you in the next video, where we continue to return to the places once overlooked, to find what should have been seen long ago.